Okay, so let's wrap up development. Let's talk about adulthood. So when it comes to adulthood, there are of course going to be some declines in fertility, sexual function, muscle strength and stamina, sensory abilities, metabolism, health, and neural processing speed. So let's kind of go through each of these one at a time. In terms of fertility, yes, there is definitely decline there. There is some decline in sexual function, but not exactly in the way you might expect. So, according to polls on older adults, from older adults, um, they do seem to engage in less sexual activity, but that doesn't actually mean that they're less satisfied. So, they're still, when you ask them, they're happy with their sex life, even though they have less frequent sexual encounters. Let's see. So it's only in like 75 plus that you typically see kind of a stronger loss in actual sexual desire. Okay. In terms of muscle strength and stamina, these things of course do decline to a certain degree as you get older. But one thing, kind of encouraging thing, is that the effects of age are fairly small compared to the effect of lifestyle, right? So, as you could imagine, someone who is in their 80s or 60s or whatever, who is in good shape, could still very easily outperform someone who's in their 20s but doesn't really exercise, right? So, yes, there is decline there, but as long as you kind of keep fit, keep exercising, take care of yourself, this doesn't mean you'll, you know, completely decline. Um, Again, you will probably be, well, pretty much guaranteed to be have less muscle strength and stamina than say you did in your 20s. But again, you can still be pretty fit as long as you know take care of things. Like I said, so of course, exercise is going to really help slow this decline. Typically, with muscle use and stamina, it's usually more an issue of disuse than anything, and certainly overuse is pretty rare. Sensory abilities do decline a bit. For example, your pupil does shrink a bit. Your pupils do tend to shrink as you age, and this allows less light to get in through your pupil, because remember, light goes through your pupils. So that makes it a little harder to see things when there's not a lot of light, obviously. For example, have you ever heard an older person tell you, oh, you know, how do you read when it's so dark out? There's probably something to that. It's probably because their pupils have shrunk more than yours have, and they need more light to read. It's not just pupils, but also smell, hearing, and touch can decline a little bit. So other sensory abilities. Metabolism does tend to slow, so you burn less energy, require less food, stuff like that. And of course, general health can decline to a certain degree. Your immune system is a little less effective overall, but years of encountering minor viruses like cold or flu actually make you a little bit more resistant to them because you have more antibodies. So they've actually found that people who are older tend to get less frequent common colds, common flu, stuff like that, than do people in their 20s. So that's another positive thing. Neural processing and kind of reaction processing in general does also seem to decline a little bit. But good news is that exercise helps this too. So exercise is really good, really important as you age. While we're on the subject, exercise, well, like we said, helps physical kind of muscles and bones, helps your energy, slows and resists Alzheimer's, reduces brain shrinkage, and promotes neurogenesis, so generating new neurons and connections, right? Now, question for you. what do you think? So say we found an association between exercise and all these different things I just listed. So neural function, energy, muscle productivity. We just found a correlation there. How might you explain that? Think about it for a second. So is it the case that those who are in better shape are just happy to be more active because they have more energy, because they're in good shape? They're willing and wanting to go for a bike ride, go for a run, lift some weights, whatever it might be? Or is it the opposite? Is it that exercising actually improves these things and the cognitive things too, right? Does exercising actually prevent you from getting Alzheimer's to a certain degree, reduce brain shrinkage? Could be either way, right? And it probably is it certainly, I would say, is to some degree both directions. But if so, the studies on this, lots of them are correlational, right? And remember, we can't say for sure what if any causation there might be. But the good news is they've actually found this experimentally as well. So actually manipulating whether older people exercise or not has been shown to causally affect these type of things. So it's not just correlational. It's a good thing to think critically about, but they have done actual experiments on it where they can determine causation. Okay, so on to cognitive development and decline. So memory, I just wanted to say one more thing about kind of neural stuff. So like I said, reaction time and processing speed do tend to decline with age. Particularly in driving, these can have consequences. So they found that older people tend to be not as good at noticing and being aware of things to their sides, but they're just as good as younger adults at noticing the possible threats kind of in front of them. Okay, so a little bit like tunnel vision, which can be good or bad. And although your driving ability can decline with age, older people don't tend to drive that much, so they're only involved in about 10% of accidents. Okay. So memory does tend to decline with age. However, it's only certain types of memory, or at least certain types more so than others. Okay, so one brain structure that does shrink as you age, that I mentioned before, is going to be your hippocampus, right? Hippocampus does seem to decline with age. And try to remember, what does the hippocampus do? Conscious memories, right? Conscious recall of specific events, experiences, details, stuff like that. And so, as you can imagine, this shrinking of the hippocampus does tend to decline, cause decline in certain types of memory with age. So, for example, recall tends to be more effective than recognition with age. So, if you remember back to memory, recall is when I give you a list of words to study, and then sometime later I ask you, write down as many words as you can, right? That's recall. Recognition is when you study, say, 20 words, then you see a mix of 20 words you studied and 20 you didn't study, and you have to decide, which did I study, which did I not study? That's recognition. Well, it turns out that recognition tends to be less affected by age than does recall, okay? So anything where you have to kind of generate the answer, when you have to recall specifics or specific details, as in recall tests, those tend to be affected with age. Not so much recognition, and to a very small degree, implicit memory. So things like conditioning, those are not, don't really get affected with age, which is good. So if you can kind of think of ways to compensate for what tests are harder, then you can pretty good off. Okay, so kind of as I mentioned before, reaction times do tend to slow. Distractions do tend to be more difficult to ignore, so you might need to allow yourself to focus more easily. And also keep in mind that multitasking tends to get harder with age. Oh, one other thing, your frontal lobe might decline a little bit, might shrink a little bit with age as well. So you remember the frontal lobe is to do with planning and also inhibition. So stopping yourself from doing something, right? So if your frontal lobe is shrinking, that could mean that you're going to behave more impulsively. And there's some evidence that impulsiveness, although it declines kind of steadily with earlier adulthood, it might jump back up a little bit in kind of later adulthood. Okay. Although oftentimes a lot of research suggests that although older adults might struggle with these things, they often find ways to compensate for physical and cognitive losses. So just as an example, when you have to freely recall something, so you're not given any kind of cue or clue, you just remember all those words from the list, right? That tends to be harder for older adults. What they struggle less with is when you give them some sort of cue, right? So you say, oh, it started with a C. That's a little bit easy. Or again, recognition tends to be fine with age. So what they find is that typically older adults will find ways to compensate. So maybe make a task more recognition based, right? Maybe make a task less recall based. Same with physical things too, right? They kind of find ways to compensate. So neurocognitive disorders are certainly possible with age. Again, exercise really combats these. Alzheimer's disease is the most common. Usually we talked about the hippocampus shrinking, plaques and tangles are usually going on in the hippocampus, which can result in Alzheimer's. And of course, severe memory loss is the symptom. Okay, so just kind of a last note in terms of cognitive effects with aging. One really interesting thing, not so much an effect, but of aging, but area of research that people are interested in is called kind of the reminiscence bump. Okay. What this is, or just generally kind of lifetime memories from older adults. So what this is if you ask older adults, remember things from your life. What actually comes to mind? What do they remember? And what you can do is you can plot the amount of things they remember as a function of time. So seen on the x-axis here, you'll notice that they remember things from their teens, quite a lot of things from their teens, less kind of when they're later 30s and earlier 40s, and a little more in their kind of 50s and 60s. So you can kind of get a sense of when you're given the opportunity to just freely recall any memories that come to mind, what memories stick out to you. And kind of as a further development, what do those mean to you? Are those kind of part of your identity? Do they help formulate who you are? Stuff like that, right? Again, the typical finding is that people remember a lot from kind of this period here, and there's a few different theories why. Some say that it's just because there's a lot going on during that time, so a lot of memorable things, whereas when you're in your teens, you're kind of still figuring out who you are. Maybe you move, maybe you move for high school, again for college, again for a job, you get married, lots of stuff kind of going on during this period. Whereas when you kind of settle down, you have a family, there's less change going on in your life. That's one theory. It's just more kind of distinct changes and events going on. The other one is that another theory is that it might just be that you remember these things because they're significant to who you are. So remember we talked about how during kind of your adolescent period, it's a significant time for kind of developing your sense of identity. So it could also be the case that you remember these things especially well because kind of particularly here in your adolescence, because they're important to kind of forming your identity. Okay, so moving on, we of course have social development. Okay. So you've probably heard before a lot about midlife crises, right? Crises. This is the notion that sometime probably in your 50s, early 50s, maybe late 40s, sometime middle age, particularly with men, they kind of have this crisis about losing their youth. Maybe they didn't do things they wanted to do, and they end up doing something unwise, right? They might pursue a younger woman. They might buy a car they can't afford. They might move away somewhere, stuff like that, right? Well, research actually does not support this at all. In fact, research suggests that people are generally quite happy in that time frame, kind of middle age, than other times, right? So, job satisfaction, marital satisfaction, levels of anxiety don't really peak during that midlife time. So, just out of curiosity, why do you think? Again, I know you can't respond, but what might kind of give the impression of why might people think that there's this midlife crisis thing that happens? Any thoughts on that? Well, maybe it's just, a changing life period and more money is available, stuff like that. Could be anything, right? I mean, just an example, buying a sports car. Well, I mean, maybe someone who's entering that period of time, their kids are finally moved out. They don't really have to support their kids anymore. Maybe they've wanted this car forever, but now they're at a point where, again, they don't have to support their kids. They're kind of well along in their career. They finally have the money to get this car, right? So it could just be kind of any kind of life period. I don't even know if people are more likely to buy sports cars at that age, but that just might be one reason if that were true. It's not so much a crisis or any great dissatisfaction or anything like that. Okay, so onto marriage. Marriage generally does predict good health and happiness, but of course a good question is what actually makes marriages last? Well, the most common time for divorce for marriages is actually in your age 20, right? So if you kind of make it through that time period, the rates of divorce go down quite a bit. Being well educated seems to be associated with greater marital satisfaction. Another thing is actually that those who live together before getting married seem to be more likely to get divorced later on. I found this very surprising. I mean, it just seems like it would make sense to me to live together and kind of see how that goes before getting married and then living together, right? I mean, I guess you could do it. I'm not sure if this includes people who are engaged and living together or not, but generally cohabitating before marriage is not predictive of kind of lasting, right? They're more likely to get divorced. So this is obviously correlational data, and there's a few suggestions as to why this might be. So it's not just that, cohabitating before marriage causes you to divorce, but it could be a bunch of other reasons. For example, some have argued that people who cohabitate before marriage might just be less committed. If people who are living together but are not thrilled with each other, they find it harder to break up because they're living together and kind of depending on each other. So they're more likely to go along with something they otherwise wouldn't. I think there was one more reason I can't remember. So something to think about. Another big one is kind of the ratio predictive of whether marriages will last is having a good ratio, a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions. So when it comes to marriage, might not just be how much you fight versus how much you do nice things for each other, but the ratio. There's some evidence of that. So, for example, one couple might, do great things for each other. They're very affectionate. They do a lot of things together, but they fight a little bit, right? Whereas another couple might hardly do nice things for each other, but fight very rarely. Those two might be fairly equal in terms of their marital satisfaction because it's not so much, it's kind of, some research suggests that it's about the ratio as opposed to just the number of fights or the number of good things that happen between them. So as long as you can meet that 5-to-1 ratio, then you're probably in good shape. But yeah, like I said, so those two couples would probably be equal, because although, you know, one fights less than the other, they also do less nice things. So again, it's about the ratio. Another thing is actually equal responsibility. So if there's kind of a good division of labor, particularly with, like, say, household stuff, that is also predictive of good marital satisfaction and not getting divorced. Okay, another question. Empty nest syndrome. Is it a real thing? So some would say that after kids move out, kind of get their own. Well, yeah, most of it's moving out. Do the parents get really unhappy? Are they really sad to, you know, see their kids go? Well, no, actually, research doesn't really support that. This idea that having your kids move out will make you miserable. If anything, it's actually the opposite. Most parents actually seem to get happier after their kids leave the house. So keep that in mind. There's a few possible reasons for this. It's not that their parents dislike you or anything, but one possible reason is that they tend to be kind of rekindle their marriage to a certain degree. So you can imagine we're having kids around the house, even if they're fairly grown up, you know, to some degree gets in the way of their relationship, right? Maybe they have less time to spend with each other because they're spending it with you, right? But when all the kids are gone, they kind of have a chance to almost have like another honeymoon, basically. So, but it is still very important that you stay in touch with your parents. So it's kind of nice to, you know, still be not super far away and still come over and still talk to them on the phone, but just living there might be nice not to have you living there. That's my point. Okay. So a few more positive notes before we wrap up for today. Actually, I'll do this one first. So let's talk a bit about death and dying. You probably heard before that the whole idea of stages of death, right? So you start out with denial, you deny that, you say, oh, I'm not actually going to die. You get angry next. There's a sense of bargaining, like, oh, I'll be a better person if I don't die. There's a sense of depression, and then finally acceptance. So this was pretty popular for a while, but it's not actually supported by research. There's not really evidence of this. And people seem to kind of each feel, they don't really go through these distinct stages, and there's definitely differences among how people will handle death approaching. Just another interesting thing is that if someone else is dying, or even like if your child were to die, staying strong kind of for others doesn't seem to help. So acting like it's not bothering you doesn't seem to help other people in your family. And one last thing is that being terminally ill is not actually, I mean, it's sad for sure, but people seem to cope with it actually fairly well. In a lot of cases, they're often not super frightened. They're often not, you know, horrified, but they're actually fairly accepting and able to cope with it. Okay, so one more positive note before we wrap up. There's kind of a bit of mixed data on this, but generally, as you get older, you to some degree actually grow happier. So, sorry, let me just back up. So, another big thing that has to do with kind of happiness with your age is actually social interactions, as you can imagine. I mean, this is true throughout your life, but it's particularly true as you age, right? So in general, if you're able to still maintain social connections, you know, with your partner and also with other friends, this is really, um, really highly predictive of being happy with age. But in general, being happy with, you generally don't get sadder with age as long as a lot of bad things, as long as some kind of bad things don't happen. For example, as we age, people will often be less responsive to sad events and actually more responsive to positive events. So the idea that your best years are behind you and you're not going to enjoy yourself as you get older is not really true. You might even be happier than before. Okay, we'll stop there.